this week. Today we're at the Menil Drawing Institute speaking with Anna Lovatt and Kelly Montana, co-curators of the exhibition Lines of Resolution, Drawing at the Advent of Television and Video. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anna, I thought we could start by talking about the network era because that seems to be an important structural piece of the exhibition. So what can you tell us about the importance of this era?
Yeah, so the network era in television history is the period from the mid-1950s to the mid-1980s. And it's really the heyday of the big television networks in the US, but also in other countries as well, where television is really restricted to a very particular schedule controlled by those networks. After that, what happens in the 1980s is that we begin to see the fragmentation of television through the introduction of cable TV, but also devices like the VCR and the remote control that allow viewers to have more control over their TV schedule. So we have really a breakup of this shared experience that beforehand was really organized by the big TV networks. So ultimately, Kelly and I decided that the exhibition would focus on this period from the mid-1950s to the mid-1980s, when more and more people, including artists, began to have televisions in their homes, where people were often consuming the same TV shows being put out by the big networks, and also before this fragmentation that occurs in the 1980s. So one of the earliest works we have in the exhibition is from 1958, and then the latest work is from about 1985. So we really focus on this period known as the network era as a way of bounding the exhibition temporally.
Kelly, can you talk a little bit about co-curating and how you decided to work on this project?
Sure. I mean, first, if I could add on to the end of Anna's comment, I think what's also helpful about that era for a viewer and that time period is that the exhibition kind of firmly ends before the rise of digital drawing and specifically the internet as well. So it's really focused on the specific era of technology. In terms of co-curating the exhibition, Anna was actually the Menil Drawing Institute's first research fellow here, and we both have ongoing research interests in modern contemporary drawing and experimental drawing practices. And her time here was really spent fostering this project. And we discovered together through her research that the Menil had a surprising number of works on paper that related to the television. So we unearthed little known aspects about drawing practices by artists like Walter de Maria, Robert Rauschenberg, that we have large holdings of. And through her time here, we decided to turn her research into an exhibition together. And so we worked on this together for about 3 years, expanding the checklist and refining the theme.
There are a diverse body of works from these different eras. I thought we could start because and maybe you guys could foreground for us a little bit how the 5 themes were developed, which are really in the exhibit. There are 5 rooms. And then we could talk more specifically after about each room or each theme and a few of the artists in each room.
Yes, I can speak to that. So the exhibition contains really a wide body of work. It contains works that were made on paper, but responding to this new technology of television, works that are made by modifying the television set and turning it into a tool for drawing, and then works of video art where the act of drawing is performed for the camera. So we began to think about these works and putting them into different categories, really based on the different ways in which these artists are engaging with the televised image. The first room is called Scan Lines, and it really focuses on the abstract qualities of the image on a cathode ray tube or CRT screen. And this is the kind of screen that was used in early analog television technology. It involves an electron beam that scans the screen from top to bottom and left to right. So the artists in that first theme are really thinking about the television set as a tool for abstract picture making. They're thinking about the scan lines, the grid or raster pattern, and really responding to the structure of the image on a CRT screen. In the second room, we have the theme of the screen in the studio, which is much more representational. So these are artists who are looking at images on television and really beginning to incorporate those images into their work. So a lot more recognizable imagery.
So the next theme is mirroring and monitoring, and it's really about the rise of video art. In 1969, the video camcorder became widely available, and artists brought that into their studio spaces to start making works of video, video and television being related technologies. And prior to the advent of the video camera, artists had to go to television networks, they had to go to stations, they had to work with broadcast professionals to make video work. And now they could make it themselves in their studio. They could rewind, re-record. And what Anna and I found fascinating was that across the globe in the 1970s, women artists without any communication with each other, not in related networks, began making works of video art where they are engaging with the image of themselves as it's being recorded in their own studios. And we find many of the artists performing drawing for the camera, often drawing on their own bodies. So it seems to be this really interesting engagement with images of women as they're being broadcast to themselves on television, and this kind of a critique or disruption of that image as it's coming back and being mirrored back to them over television media. The following gallery after that has the theme of feedback. And we see, again, artists really reflecting on being able to engage immediately with what's being recorded on the video. And so there's this wonderful work by Nina Sobel that was actually first installed and made available to the public here in Houston at the Contemporary Arts Museum, Houston. And in this work, she invited pairs of people to be hooked up to an EEG machine. So they had electrodes attached to their scalps, and their brainwave activity was being recorded, but then mapped on top of themselves in a real-time recording. So they were able to watch their brainwave activity mapped on top of their own faces. And so this idea of feedback, you can see people responding in real time to their brain activity, trying to narrate what's happening, trying to understand what's happening, and also trying to sync up their brainwave patterns, which is what the artist Nina Sobel was most interested in, very interested in this idea of nonverbal communication. So the idea that two people could be on the same page, so to speak, without verbally communicating really inspired her, and in fact continues to drive her practice to this day.
The final theme of the exhibition is interference, and this section really looks at artists who interfere with and scramble and reconstitute televised messages. So in that section, we have Howardina Pindell's video drawings, where she is overlaying the TV screen with acetate sheets, bearing her own diagrammatic drawings. So they really disrupt and reroute the images on screen. So we're really thinking in that section of the exhibition about artists engaging in a kind of critical response to televised messages, but also highlighting processes of censorship and control and trying to resist those processes in their own artistic practices.
I'm a fan of Non June Paik's work, and he's very well known as a video artist. I've mostly seen his later work in his career, and so it was refreshing to see kind of earlier works. I wondered if we could talk about some of the artists in the scan lines theme, including Paik.
Yes, and actually Zen for TV, which we have in the exhibition, was included in Paik's very first exhibition of televisions in Wuppertal in Germany in 1963. So this was the first time he began to explore television as this new medium for art making. And in Zen for TV, he removed some of the magnets in the television set that sweep that electron beam from the top to bottom to make it draw a single line down the center of the screen. So this is one of a series of works where Paik responds to an instruction by the composer Lamont Young to draw a straight line and follow it. Famously, he once did this by dipping his head into ink and dragging it along the ground or along a roll of paper on the ground to create a line. In Zen for TV, he's using the television set to create this line across the center of the screen. We also have many works on paper by Paik. So as you mentioned, he's really known as the father of video art, but he had a daily drawing practice, which also focused on this idea of the scan line, often scanning the paper from top to bottom with a colored pencil or a propeller pencil, and sometimes referring to other structures such as the spiral, which he really saw as a way of representing videotape, this reel of tape winding around itself. So we have many drawings by Paik that have not really been exhibited before in the exhibition. And we also pair him with a lesser known artist called Karl Otto Goetz, or K.O. Goetz, from Germany, who was a really good friend of Paik's and was actually at that exhibition in 1963. Goetz had begun to experiment with cathode ray tube technology when he was in the German Air Force during World War II, because that technology is also used in radar as well as domestic television sets. And he really began to think of this technology as a way of creating electronically generated pictures. So after the war, he began experimenting with a series of works he calls the raster pictures. Again, the raster is the name for that pattern of scan lines on an analog television set. And he begins creating large-scale drawings on canvas or on paper where he breaks the entire rectangle into a grid of points that are variable in terms of lightness and darkness. And he then uses a system to generate these gridded images, which really do look quite a lot like static or snow on an early television set. And again, he's calling these the raster pictures, so really relating them to that raster pattern of scan lines on a television set.
Let's go to the next room. As you said, it's the screen in the studio, correct? We start to move into artists using recognizable images, maybe images inspired by media or mimicking something, again, about, the abstraction of the television is really important in the first room, but in this room it's combined with now other types of imagery. So if we could talk about a few of those artists, maybe Rauschenberg, maybe Mimi Smith.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I think your observation is a really good one, that this is a room that explores representation and how real images from the television start permeating artists' practice. And Rauschenberg's a wonderful example of this. When you look through oral histories about time that people spent with Robert Rauschenberg, invariably there's always an offhand comment about how the television was on. He really was someone that really believed about letting life into the studio, letting life into his work. And the television was one way of doing that. It's something that brought in the world and brought the images directly into his studio. In his transfer drawings, where he clipped images from magazines and newspapers and transferred them directly into a work of art, his friend and colleague, John Cage, actually referred to these works as appearing as though they were many different televisions tuned to different channels. So they have this flickering quality to them, given how the images were being transferred. They're kind of in and out of legibility, but still really legible as examples from pop culture, from the world around him. Mimi Smith is another just wonderful example of an artist that had an ongoing several years engagement directly with the television. She made a series of drawings that she called her television drawings. And the basis of these are transcriptions that she made directly from television, TV news broadcasts, evening specials. And at this time, she was particularly attuned to the presence of the television because she had just moved her studio into her home and she was raising 2 young children. So she had the TV on often in the background. And whereas Rauschenberg felt like it was this kind of propulsion, this exuberance that was coming into the studio, Mimi Smith actually referred to it as a kind of invasion, as this kind of object that she felt like she couldn't escape from. She couldn't escape from its presence, its noise, and the way it brought all news, good or bad, directly into the home space. So for these works, her transcription of the news can be quite jarring, quite provocative, especially from the one entitled Violence in America, which is titled after an evening news special on that topic. And she's transcribed the news so that it forms the shape of a TV screen with those curved edges along each corner. And once she's filled that screen, it's overfull of these words and texts and anecdotes about violence in America, it spills out to form another screen. And I think what's really telling, very insightful about Mimi Smith's decision to do this is that those screens take on kind of the form of a human presence. It takes on this sense of maybe a head and shoulders, again, giving a sense of that sense of invasion and another presence in the home that Mimi Smith so well observed.
I would like to talk a little bit about the Dennis Oppenheim work, because I think that it encapsulates a lot of the sentiment throughout the exhibit, but is specifically dealing with this concept of feedback. So what do you think about that work? Could you describe it for us?
Yes, so this is a work called A Feedback Situation, where Oppenheim and his son Eric stand in front of the camera, but with their backs to the camera, and they draw on one another's backs. Dennis Oppenheim is feeding a particular line to his son. So he's drawing on his back, and his son, through touch, is then trying to replicate that line on his father's back. So they can't see what one another is doing, but there is this kind of call and response between the two of them, which Oppenheim described as a process of feedback. Feedback is also something that is implicit to the medium of video. So if you reroute a monitor into its camera, you'll create a kind of feedback loop. And lots of video artists in the 1970s are really interested in this idea of the feedback loop. What Oppenheim is doing that is different is to apply this to drawing, the passing back and forth of a line, but also to apply it to the idea of family relationships. So moving back and forth between generations. He talks about his drawing being fed back to him through his son. So lots of really interesting things going on in that drawing, which really links feedback to video, but also to interactions between people, how we might modify our behavior and respond to a family member, and they might then do the same in response to us. So it's a very complex work, but very visually striking and illustrative of this idea of feedback that forms the fourth part of our exhibition.
Could you talk a little bit more about the feminist artists' work in the show?
Certainly. So our section, Mirroring and Monitoring, features many women artists working in the 1970s into the 1980s and beyond, whose practice deeply engaged with feminism, specifically the second wave feminism of the era. As media representations of themselves were being broadcast back to them through television, they began working with these images and images of themselves to critique and disrupt these stereotypes. So not only do we see in these videos them performing drawing for the camera to disrupt these rituals of beautification or these strictures on how women are expected to present and identify in public space. But these are also a group of women artists that these concerns flow through their practices, many of them to their present day art making.
Thank you both so much. We're out of time, but it's been a joy to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Find all of our videos and sign up for our newsletter at artthisweek.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.